So now we're going to move on to the bad. And when I say the bad, these aren't necessarily awful. These are things that we have to consider. They're not pluses, but they're not huge minuses for SIP either. And the first one of those that we really need to look at is the use of a session border controller. A session border controller, for those of you who are new to SIP, acts somewhat like a firewall and somewhat like a translator. So it sits between your IP-enabled PBX and your SIP provider. And it does a couple of things. Like I said, number one, it acts as a firewall, but number two, and most importantly, it does translations, because not all SIP is created equally, and not all SIP providers are created equally, as Travis said. So there may be some things, based on the way that ShoreTel does a transfer or a conference or a hold or something of that nature, may be slightly different than the way the SIP provider is looking for it. So that's where the session border controller comes in. It does those translations and keeps things flowing. But the downside to it is it's an additional point that you have to troubleshoot, additional points that you have to consider if you're having issues. You also have to, depending on the session border controller model that you're using, take licensing into consideration.
And session border controllers are not created equally either. there's
right.
Ones that we like to work with, and there's ones that we run from. So not getting into specific manufacturers, but there's definitely good and bad with that side of it as well.
Right. So the second bad, if you will, is codecs. And again, for those of you who are new to SIP, what codecs are compression rates. So how much of your voice packets get compressed to save bandwidth. And not all codecs are created equal. This is one where bigger is not necessarily better either. G711 and G729 are the industry standard codecs. There are some that are considered lossless, no compression, that actually, to most people's opinion, don't sound as good as either G711 or 729, which have some compression. And not every carrier supports every codec. Some of them support 711, 729, but that's something that you have to consider and discuss with your SIP provider before implementation to make sure that we're using the same codecs that they support. Because things that can happen if you have incorrect codec settings or codec mismatches is you can have no speech path, you can have one-way speech path, dropped calls, or just failure to establish calls at all. And your bandwidth is also a consideration. 729 is a good bit more compressed than 711. It still has good sound quality. 711 is, I want to say, about 30% compressed. So you're looking 30, 40K per call usually, depending on what type of overhead you have. But it's still something you have to consider. So the next thing, and Travis has already touched on this a little bit, so your internet or your networking, you have to be very cognizant of what type of service you're using for your SIP trunks to be delivered. Of course, in a perfect world, our preference is to have a dedicated network connection, MPLS, something that has guaranteed QoS end-to-end and has actual enforceable SLAs to where you're going to get the bandwidth that you're paying for, you're going to get QoS end-to-end, so that we don't have things like jitter, call drops, choppy voice. Those are all things that have to be taken into consideration. You also have to consider your firewall and your network setup. Because this isn't an IP technology, you have to consider making sure that you have the right ports open. If you have firewalls internally for sending things across your WAN, those all have to be considered. The next one, and actually a pretty big one, is 911 calling. Depending on the carrier that you're using and depending on your PBX, 911 can get a bit tricky with SIP. One thing that ShoreTel does well is it has a base functionality E911 service built in to where you can specify ahead of time what your IP address ranges for each one of your sites are. And then the ShoreTel system is going to look and say, hey, this phone's in the IP address for the headquarters site, so that means I need to send out the caller ID for the headquarters location to the PSAF if somebody dials 911, and on down the line based on whatever other sites you have. But some areas you may have to put in a full E911 solution. Those can get a little tricky. Those can get a little costly. So you need to take that into consideration. And then the final point on this slide is your equipment and licensing. So right now there's 12 different options from ShoreTel of devices that can house SIP trunks. You also have to take into account licensing for those, because whether you're doing, ShoreTel has both physical and virtual, but either path requires a license.